Thank you for joining Jennifer Strauss & Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email him directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. Great, this is just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services to federal contractors. This ranges from record analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do offer advertising in our newsletter, so you can reach out to this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, Christopher Shiplett is going to be our speaker today, and he's going to be covering HUBZones, how to qualify. Thank you for joining us, Chris, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. Good morning. My name is Chris Shiplett. I'm a lawyer with Randolph Law. We do almost exclusively government contracting law and specialize in small businesses, in particular small set-aside businesses such as Sba 8A businesses, woman-owned small businesses, and the topic of today's conversation, HUBZones. So I'm going to talk today very briefly about what a HUBZone is, and then in a little bit more depth about how to qualify your company as a HUBZone company. This is a very often nuanced topic, so we're really only able to hit the highlights in this format, but I have included a couple URL links on the slideshow that can give you access to more in-depth information. Next slide, please. So the first thing to really talk about here is what the HUBZone program is. HUBZone's a federal government contracting program, just as I mentioned, like the Sba 8A program for minority-owned businesses, the Sba woman-owned program for woman-owned small businesses that provide certain benefits to companies that look to contract with the federal government. So what a company will do is register with the Small Business Administration as a HUBZone company. If the Small Business Registration approves your registration as a HUBZone company, you're then eligible to receive these various benefits. And the benefits, we actually have a second presentation at 11:30 about what those benefits are, but briefly, the benefits are access to potentially set-aside contracts, access to potentially IDIQ or multi-award contracts with HUBZone set-aside components and that type of thing. The federal government is obligated by law to spend or to attempt to spend at least 3% of federal contracting dollars year over year on HUBZone companies. So that's a basic intro to what the HUBZone program is. Now, the basis, go ahead, next slide. The basis of the HUBZone program is this concept of HUBZones. HUBZones are historically underutilized business zones. By law, the Census Bureau has to designate certain places as having been sort of historically depressed, or the legal term, I guess, used by SBA is underutilized. Every 10 years of the decennial census, after gathering all of the data, the Census Bureau then evaluates the data, analyzes the data, and in an initial report designated a whole bunch of HUBZones across the country, and now every 10 years maintains those HUBZones. The HUBZones are listed by usually zip code, typically, although a lot of times there are multi-zip code or split zip codes, particularly in rural areas. As sort of a basis, you can consider most HUBZones are located in either central cities, rural areas that are historically underutilized, often near or on Native American Indian reservations, and in many cases areas near military bases are HUBZones as well. Sba Publishes a map, which for a long time was very difficult to use, but recently, I checked it yesterday and again today, recently it's become very easy to use. You type in a location and Sba will provide you on a map, whether it's in or outside of a HUBZone, and certain information about that location. You can go ahead to the next slide. This one might be a little more difficult to see, but this is an example of the map. So I've actually put in the address of my law firm here in Falls Church, and you can see that in the middle the map designates what certain zones are by color, and then on the right-hand side you'll see that my particular office location is not qualified as a hub zone, but if you get a location in a hub zone, it will describe when it was qualified by date, how long the qualification lasts, and certain other information about it. So really, the first thing to know about the HUBZone program and applying for the HUBZone program is that it is a geographical location-based program, thus the map, thus the real focus on addresses and stuff like that. So you say, all right, well, that's what the HUBZone program is. What are the specific requirements? And go ahead to the next slide. And that's very straightforward seeming. There's a lot of nuances to it, and we'll talk about some of those. But the real basic qualifications are very straightforward, and that's this. A minimum of 35% of a company's employees must live in a hub zone. Doesn't matter where the employees work, only matters where the employee's residence is. The second one is that your primary business location must also be in a hub zone. And then the third one is that you must be a small business as that's defined by the SBA. And we'll talk about the small business qualifications, but those are more generic. The real key is your people have to live in a hub zone, and your primary business location also has to be in a hub zone. Go ahead to the next slide. So what does it mean for 35% of your employees to live in a hub zone? Well, first off, there's kind of two pieces of it. Number one is that a minimum of 35% of your employees must live in a hub zone. So the example I've given, and you can don't move to the next slide, but if you all look at bullet point number 4 here, the example is if you only have 4 employees, you have to have 2 in a hub zone, and that's a very important key to note, because one of the definitions of a hub zone company is you have to be a small business, which means by definition, oftentimes the businesses that are applying for HUBZone don't have that many employees. So if you start out with 1 employee yourself, you have to live in a HUBZone. If you get a second employee, either you or the other employee, 50%, have to live in a HUBZone. If you get a third employee, because 1 out of 3 is only 33%, 2 out of the 3 employees have to live in a HUBZone, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing to think about, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit to kind of the maintenance, is particularly for small government contractors, your employee number can fluctuate dramatically from year to year. You have 4 employees, you get a new contract, that contract calls for 4 more employees. All of a sudden, now you have doubled your size, and you need to make sure that you are compliant both with your 4 employees and with your new employee number of 8 employees. So minimum of 30% of employees have to live in a hub zone. You have to demonstrate that the people do actually live in the hub zone. The main way to demonstrate that is a driver's license or an other government issued ID. Sometimes I have seen among my clients, particularly in big cities with a large college population, a lot of colleges are in or near hub zones, and a lot of folks will hire college students as part of their attempt to maintain their hub zone status. A college student does live in a hub zone if they live in the dorm or off-campus housing or that type of thing, but their driver's license won't match. So what you would have to provide at that then is both a rental agreement, and I didn't put it here, but you have to have a declaration or an affidavit from that employee. So the real key is, you know, 35%, you have to demonstrate, or that employee has to demonstrate that they reside there. The typical base demonstration is driver's license or government ID. You can use others, but you also have to accompany that with a declaration or an affidavit. The other thing to think about is the definition of quote-unquote employee. SBA, when reviewing this, and typically this will come up more often in a bid protest against your HUBZone status than in your initial application, but the SBA will generally consider the IRS's definition of an independent contractor in determining whether a person is an employee or not. But they won't defer to the IRS, they won't even ask the IRS, but they'll take kind of the IRS's 9 qualifications. So the example I often get is an independent contractor who's a business development professional for you. If that person is an independent contractor but works all of their time for you, doesn't work for anybody else, is only a 1099 because they're retired government, or they've got some other side gig, but it's not an important side gig going on, that person will be considered an employee. However, and the other example I would give, if you have a technical employee, I'm thinking typically of like computer services companies. If you have a technical employee who's a 1099 and they also work for a bunch of other companies, and they don't do a whole lot of work for you, that person will be considered an independent contractor. And number one, you don't need to account for them, but also number two, if they do live in a HUBZone, you don't get credit for them. So 35% of your employees have to live in a HUBZone. Go ahead, next slide. The second key is that your primary business location must be in a HUBZone. Now that seems self-explanatory, but it's not. And I want to be clear here. 99 times out of 100, your primary business location is your headquarters. When you start a business, typically small businesses, you start from your house, especially service-based businesses or government contractor-based businesses. You start from your house and you're going to work on-site at the government. Then maybe you grow a little bit and you get an office space. That office is your headquarters. That office then would also be your primary business location. But here's the key. SBA defines your primary business location, quote unquote, as the location where most of your employees are, accepting government sites or accepting client sites. So if you have 2 locations, you have a main office where one or two of your admin people plus your executives are, and then you have a satellite office that's close to your client, and 10 of your folks are located at the satellite office. That satellite office will be your primary business location. The other thing to be aware of, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about the SBA's evaluation process, is the SBA will do a site visit. And when you designate a place as your primary business location, the SBA is going to look to ensure that you have enough workspace for all of the people that you claim work there. So I've seen that come about in 2 circumstances. Number one, a construction company where all of, let's say, the estimators or the project managers have workspace at the company's headquarters. They don't have workspace on the job site because they go to multiple job sites, but perhaps they share a workspace. The SBA is going to question that because they're going to say, well, you say that you have 8 people on site at your headquarters, but I only see 4 workstations. And you would have to explain, well, I've got multiple project managers and those project managers share workspaces. They don't have another designated work location because they manage multiple projects, but they also share space while they're here. The second situation I've seen, which often comes up with startup companies, is a shared work environment like a WeWork or a Regis or that type of thing. You are absolutely allowed to have your headquarters, your primary business location, in a shared work environment. But what has happened, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a lot of HUBZones that were claiming that they had a headquarters in a shared work environment in a HUBZone, but in fact that was just a virtual location. They got their mail there, they got their phone lines there, but they never actually rented office space because it was cheaper, and then they'd work from home or they'd work from the client site or whatever. You can't do that. You can work from one of these shared business locations, but you can't work virtually there. If you have 4 people there, you have to be renting enough space for 4 people. And in some of those places, it's like 2 offices that you can share as long as you've got 4 workstations. Finally, I'll note that when you apply, there's a big question about the employee's work location. We talked about that within the context of a virtual workspace. We've talked about that just now within the context of like employees who go out to job sites. But the other thing to think about is in context of virtual employees who aren't necessarily going out to job sites. And I'll talk, for example, about business development employees. A lot of employees of that level and of that nature work from home. If they don't have a workstation or a place to work at the office, their business location will be deemed their house. And so in terms of number of employees at your primary business location, they won't be counted. So you really do need to think about kind of a physical ability to have a specific head count at your primary business location, which is oftentimes your headquarters, but might not be. Next slide. So the first two were at least 35% of your employees living in a hub zone. The next one was your primary business location being in a hub zone. The third one is the small business requirements. You have to be a small business. Now, there's not a separate registration process for determining whether you are a small business. It's self-certification as to whether you're a small business, but it is a very well-developed body of law and regulation as to what is or what is not a small business, and it is according to the SBA's determination. The SBA makes their determination, well, they don't make a determination, it's the SBA's rules. The SBA's rules are embodied in a document that divides out businesses by their NAICS code, which is the North American Industry Classification System code, NAICS. If you're familiar with government contracting, you should be very familiar with the NAICS codes. And oftentimes, most times the NAICS codes are, you have a revenue cap and a look-back period based on your NAICS code. So for example, for certain NAICS codes, you have to have not had more than $10 million in revenue, and the look-back period is over the past 3 or 5 years. I say 3 or 5 because it's become very confusing with recent regulations, but just know that it's an average over the past set of years. Other NAICS codes have a size standard based on the number of employees you have. So for our purposes for today, just know that you have to be a small business according to the SBA's requirements, and you have to be controlled 51% by a U.S. citizen or other. I said other because there's about 15 different categories. They probably don't apply, but they are, for example, what's called a community development corporation, or what's called an Alaska Native corporation, or what's called Native Hawaiian Benefit Corporation, which are by definition not U.S. citizens because they're companies, they're not people, but they are allowed to be considered small businesses. So you have to be a small business. You have to have your primary business location within a hub zone, and you have to have at least 35% of your employees living in a hub zone. Next slide. So then what is the process for applying? And this is very straightforward. You go to this website, which I've listed below, copy and paste this URL. And based on the URL, you can read all sorts of information about how you apply. You submit a ton of documents to the SBA through what the SBA calls their general log-on or login system, their GLS system. You have to be registered with the various other federal government systems, so you have to have a DUNS number, D-U-N-S, Dun & Bradstreet. You have to have a SAM profile, SAM.gov, SAM.gov profile, which every government contractor has to have. Then you file an application through the SBA's general logon system application process. And the application documents are typically, the main document is a spreadsheet where you list each of your employees and you list where they live. And then the SBA goes through and marks, and there's an autofill cell in the spreadsheet, so it'll autofill for you where those employees are, where they live, and ultimately whether 35% of those employees live within a hub zone. You will be asked for backup documentation to include both documentation of your primary business location, so a lease agreement, any potentially utilities that you get there, that type of stuff. You'll be asked for backup documentation for each of your employees, driver's license or some other indicia that they live where they say they live. You'll be asked for general financial information to demonstrate that you, whoever the person is on the application, own 51% or more of the company, and that the company is a small business. So you'll be asked for company revenue, company tax returns, that type of thing. You'll also be asked for payroll documentation so that the SBA can match up what you submit on the spreadsheet with what you actually are reporting to the IRS vis-a-vis your number of employees. You file all that online. SBA, like I said, will do a site visit. They'll come out to your headquarters or your primary, what you present as your primary business location. They'll look it over. They'll review the applications, and they will then approve you. If you match all of the criteria, they'll approve you as a hub zone. At that point, you are indicated in the SBA's database and in the SAM.gov database as a hub zone, and you can start applying or proposing for hub zone set-aside contracts and other hub zone opportunities. Next slide, please. So once you are in the hub zone process, it is a permanent process. It's a permanent designation similar to the veteran-owned or service-disabled veteran-owned or woman-owned, but different from the 8A. 8A ends after 9 years, but it's a permanent designation. The SBA will recertify every 3 years. The recertification process is almost identical to the initial application process, but be aware, within 3 years, your size may have changed, so you may need to explain that. And obviously, you will need to explain every 3 years where your employees live. Hub zones change every 10 years, which might seem like a long time, but we are, it's 2019, so you got the 2020 census, and a year or two after that, the new hub zones come out. So if you started a hub zone company today, by the time of your first recertification, your hub zone may move out from under you. But you can certainly, typically what happens is hub zones change, and that means that your primary business location, which was in a hub zone, is no longer in a hub zone. And if you want to maintain your hub zone status, you have to move your headquarters. But just be aware that they change every 10 years. Excuse me. The main way that SBA polices the hub zone program is by bid protest by unsuccessful bidders for hub zone contracts who complain to the SBA that you are not a hub zone. And what will happen in that case is that the bid protest will go up to the SBA, and SBA will ask you to demonstrate your compliance with the hub zone requirements. And it'll be the same compliance as you demonstrated when you applied. That is 35% of the people and your primary business location, and that you're a small business, all with the proper backup and documentation. But oftentimes in that bid protest context, you will also be asked to specifically respond to whatever specific concern the bid protester had. So for example, a lot of times bid protesters will say, well, your primary business location is definitely not in a hub zone. And SBA will ask you to respond specifically to that. Or they'll say, look, you've got 3 or 4 different companies, you're sharing employees. We think you haven't counted the employees of the other companies as part of your base for your 35%. And in addition to just basically explaining, you will also have to specifically respond to that. There's 2 different, and I'm looking at 4, 5, and 6 here in terms of the bullet points. There's really 2 different regimes for I guess, compliance. SBA, they recheck every 3 years, and the real key at SBA is you really only have to be attempting to maintain. So SBA will let you fall out of the 35% compliance or the headquarters compliance for some unspecified period of time if it's not your fault and you're trying to rectify it. So as regards SBA compliance, you are attempting to maintain the 35%. But as regards bid protest compliance, you have to be at 35% at the time that really to successfully respond to the bid protest. And the bid protest measures your compliance at two points: at the time that you submit the bid and at award. So two separate points. So in responding to a bid protest, you'll have to send your payroll records for both your bid submission, which could have been all the way back 18 months or 24 months before, plus your time of reward. So I guess my final point here, you understand the criteria, you've applied, you've succeeded, now you're maintaining your HUBZone is strategies for compliance. And the main one is to have employee physical locations be a part of both your onboarding and your offboarding process and keep those records. So for example, every time somebody leaves your company, you want to ensure that you have their last address that they lived in while they were at the company, so that if you get a bid protest of your HUBZone status 2 years down the road, you can demonstrate that at the time you submitted the bid, that particular person who's been gone from your company for 2 years did live in a HUBZone. Next slide, and I'll just conclude very briefly. So HUBZone is a very straightforward application process. It's a very straightforward program. There are significant benefits to being a HUBZone company, but when you apply and your compliance after you apply and successfully are registering in the program, there are some nuances to it, in particular as a company will grow, and in particular if you have operations in multiple physical locations. I hope this has been helpful, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Chris, for joining us today. If you have any questions for him, please feel free to reach out to him via the email or phone number shown on your screen. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.